On May the 1st, 1986, 3 Minnesotans were among 6 people who reached the North Pole by dog sled. They traveled across 500 miles of sea ice, surviving only on what they carried with them. KSTP-TV is proud tonight to bring you their story. The following program includes the world premiere of North to the Pole, a joint production of KSTP and the National Geographic Society. Here is your host, Jason Davis.
Good evening. It was more than 2 years ago that photographer Don Friedel and I produced the first news reports of Minnesotan Will Steger's plans to lead an expedition to the North Pole. We went on to cover a 5,000-mile training run to Barrow, Alaska, the gathering of an 8-member team from various parts of the world, the long, cold months of training across the northernmost reaches of Canada, and finally, the 2 months the team spent on the frozen Arctic Ocean striving to reach the pole. Tonight, 4 of the team members, co-leader Will Steger, co-leader Paul Shirky, Anne Bancroft, and Ironman Bob Mantell, are here to watch the first showing of a documentary about their efforts. After we've seen it, we'll be back to talk to the team about their adventure and to see some of the sights and hear some of the sounds that didn't make it into the documentary. So it's my pleasure to invite you to join us in watching the world's first showing of North to the Pole.
For 60 days, you're constantly in 40, 50 below weather. You're dealing with 8 people, 40 dogs. You have a lot of pressure.
I didn't want to go on the trip if I couldn't cut what was going to happen. I think I'm very stubborn and steady.
I was interested in how the old explorers had managed to do it and how I would go about doing it if I were ever foolish enough to try.
The top of the world is not a continent, but a vast, forbidding sea, the Arctic Ocean. Those who want to reach the pole must cross this treacherous expanse of fragile, shifting ice. Few would dream of going there on foot, but every now and then, courageous souls decide to try. Will Steger had been looking for adventure ever since he sailed the entire Mississippi at the age of 15. Paul Shirky had abandoned a career in journalism to pursue a life in the outdoors. In 1984, they made a fateful choice: to journey north by dog sled to the pole. They would leave their home in Ely, Minnesota, traveling some 1,400 miles to train at Frobisher Bay, an isolated town in northern Canada. Then they would fly north again to Ellesmere Island, the departure point for their trek to the pole. The expedition would be following historic footsteps. Of all the men who tried to be the first to reach the pole, Robert Peary was among the most determined. He trekked across the ice in 1909, using Inuit to help him blaze the trail. It was a cruel 5-week journey in brutal temperatures. When it was over, history recorded Peary's triumphant claim to success. His achievement scarcely dampened the enthusiasm of successive generations. Some turned their attention to the South Pole. Others kept on going north, using every form of transportation they could find. Will Steger rejected the conveniences of modern exploration. Independent by nature, he decided that his journey would be absolutely self-sufficient. He would try to be the first since Peary to attain the pole by dog sled without resupply.
We wouldn't be relying on outside help. We wouldn't rely on airplanes to fly us in fresh dogs, dry clothing, food, nor would we rely on the radio to give us information on our whereabouts.
I think it appealed to a lot of folks, too, that we were going to the top of the world without technological assistance in an era when technological assistance is the name of so many games. We were doing it under our own power, and there's something that rang true for us and for a lot of people in that regard.
By the fall of 1985, Steger and Shirky had recruited 5 adventurers who gathered at Ely to prepare for the greatest challenge of their lives.
Oh, you're Richard. Okay, now I know everybody.
Eskimo sled dogs, which would pull a mountain of supplies across the ice, were imported from the Arctic. Most had never seen a tree until they came to northern Minnesota.
Pull them out? Yeah, just Jane.
In some respects, the dogs were more important than some of the team members. We knew that if worse came to worse, we could crawl on our hands and knees if we had to keep going northwards, but we couldn't pull those heavy sleds behind us. So if the dogs quit, the trip was over.
Aside from stamina, each member of the team was chosen for a special set of skills. Brent Bodie, an expert trainer of sled dogs, would help the expedition keep its animals under control.
They're powerful.
Richard Weber, a Canadian cross-country ski champion, was picked in part for his ability to scout a trail through the ice. Bob Mantell, a carpenter and mechanic, has taken numerous long-distance trips by ski and dog sled. For his perseverance, he would come to be known as Iron Man Mantell.
One of the few times that I really feel alive is when I'm on these trips and out on the ice. And at that time, everything is really vital and direct. Everything is really clear.
Geoff Carroll would contribute many years of Arctic wilderness experience. Anne Bancroft is an expert mountaineer. If the journey were successful, she would be the first woman to trek to the pole.
I've always wanted to go as far north as I could possibly go, because to go north for me has always meant adventure.
From the outset, self-sufficiency was paramount, and careful planning was essential. They built their sleds from scratch, according to their own design. They sought advice from experts, learning how to cope with medical emergencies. And like astronauts in training, they were tested, weighed, and measured with the latest high technology.
First bath of the year. Need to go on the outside. Right.
Bob McCarrow, an outward bound instructor from New Zealand, joined the expedition in the final days of training. The team was now complete. The time had come to start the journey north.
Every ounce has to be carefully decided, every ounce of food, every ounce of equipment. Since we're self-reliant, there is no margin for error. Transporting 8 people, 49 dogs, and 3 tons of equipment to the Arctic was a staggering task. Still, by January 1986, the team had traveled 1,400 miles north by truck and plane to Frobisher Bay. Frozen in for much of the year, this small community has everything that makes the Arctic a forbidding place. Here, the team would train for 6 bitterly cold weeks, building their endurance for conditions worse than anything they could imagine.
Are you enjoying this? Oh yeah, it's great fun.
You know, the only thing that's a problem is icing of the eyelashes, as far as I can tell.
Oh, why is that a problem?
Well, you can't see. Once they start to glue together, then you can see, then it's very difficult to see where you're at. So, right, that's the only thing. Everything else is really warm.
What can you do about that?
Just gotta keep melting them. Putting your hand on there and melting them away and then starting again.
Even on the brink of their run on the pole, the team continued to debate the very essence of their plan to travel unsupported.
All right, if the dog is such a big issue.
I didn't say, it doesn't bother me
Mantell
at all.
said it, if Steger said it.
We debated constantly. It seemed like we were going round and round on what exactly unsupported was.
Does that mean if we use the snow to build an igloo, is that support?
And I realized that it was very different for individuals. And you would think that 8 people embarking on an unsupported trip to the North Pole would have that down long before March 8th, but it wasn't the case.
By late winter, the time has come to move north once more. But faced again with the challenge of transporting their gear, the expedition encounters a sudden crisis.
We were about 1,500 pounds overweight. They couldn't get all the gear and dogs on the plane.
Turn her on her side.
And we had to come up with a solution within 3 hours. It's either that or cancel the trip.
We added a fifth team about 2 months ago, and that's what really pushed us over. So we'll have to charter another plane, smaller plane, to cover up the last 2,000 pounds, which will run about $12,000 extra.
12,000 bucks?
Yeah.
Have you got the 12,000?
No, we don't.
There's another dog in the truck.
"1,350 miles north of Frobisher Bay, Canada ends abruptly. This is Ellesmere Island. Here, coastal mountains meet the frozen Arctic Sea. For those who seek the pole, this is a place to contemplate the overwhelming challenges that lie ahead. March 8, 1986, minus 68 degrees. From this lonely spot, they start their journey into even greater loneliness. Only a fragile home movie camera will bear witness to their failure or success.
Hey, Goofy, you all set to go? Anybody? Hey?
In the pages of his daily journal, Steger would record a moment of elation for the morning of day 1. We start finally. For the first time, the 8 of us together and alone. For the first time, everything assembled. I saw my dream come true before my eyes in the mist that rose from the dogs' bodies. We are going to the pole.
Ready, target, let's go! Wait.
But Steger's euphoria is no match for the frozen waters of the Arctic Ocean. The expedition first encounters an endless range of pressure ridges, stunted mountains formed by overlapping sheets of ice. The sleds will only move ahead if they are pushed across the ridges, and at minus 70, the ice is rough and brittle. Often they must stop to clear a path, inch by agonizing inch.
On the first day, we set out with 5 sleds, 1,300 pounds on each sled. And the temperature was 72 below zero. And we had this excruciating heavy ice. We had 500 miles to look forward to.
By the end of day 1, they have traveled 1 solitary mile.
I knew we'd get through. But sometimes I wondered, boy, whew, this is pretty heavy stuff.
Let's go.
Laden down with food for 60 days, the team is forced to travel by relay, leaving part of their load on the ice, then returning to retrieve it.
Let's go.
For every mile of forward movement, they must travel a total of 3.
Well, it's been a tough 12 days. Constant 40, 50 below weather.
Every morning opens with the grueling task of lashing sleds with frozen fingers. Then it's hour upon hour of chopping ice and pushing sleds across the pressure ridges. The temperature remains inhumanly cold. Everyone suffers, but Will Steger, who is older than most of the others by a decade, seems to suffer most of all. My face has been entirely frozen, he confides in his journal. It takes constant awareness and attention. In the slightest breeze, the eyelids freeze shut.
6-9, Steger Expedition here. How do you copy? Over.
The only concession to electronic technology is a portable radio. They call in their position every few days, but they get no information in return. Even news from friends and family is ruled out as emotional support.
Cold, clear, seems to be clearing up.
Navigation is accomplished the traditional way, by sextant alone. As the group's official navigator, Shirky is responsible for keeping the expedition on course. It's a difficult task, compounded by the constant movement of the ice. Still, however slowly, the team is making progress.
Yesterday we made our first 10-mile day. We've been out. I think it's just our 15th day right now. But the key now is we're getting lighter. We're relaying every day. I think we have maybe 4 or 5 more days to relay. Pretty soon we'll be speeding up. We'll probably be averaging about 15 miles a day within about 8 or 9 days.
What are you doing, Ann?
I'm getting our dinner ready. We'll start off with soup. Pemmican. Same as the dogs. And cheese. And butter.
Each day ends as it began, with something else to do. The evening meal must be cooked above a white gas stove. Footwear, torn and battered by the ice, must be patched together for another day of Arctic misery. Privacy is hard to come by. There is no such thing as free time. As the expedition consumes its supplies, it becomes possible to trim some of the sleds, making them move more easily across the ice. The excess wood can be used for fuel.
This is the kind of stuff I've been pushing my guts out behind for the last 3 weeks, and I say good riddance, and I'll enjoy the heat from it tonight.
130 miles gone. Another 300. Looking forward to it?
Well, yeah, I'll be glad when it's done, but as the weather gets warmer, it's certainly more enjoyable.
For weeks, the dogs have pulled and strained across the roughest ice. Cold and exhausted, they require constant care. Dog burnout is a growing concern. With dog food carefully rationed, the animals are adequately fed, but they are ravenously hungry by the end of every day. In a moment of destructive mischief, they demolish 20 pounds of precious food before they can be stopped.
Watch it,
I got a lot of hungry dogs. Jump the sled.
Could have got the whole bag. No big problem, but all this stuff is valuable.
In the almost overwhelming Arctic emptiness, even minor problems have a way of adding up. One event spells trouble for McKerrow. Struck by a runaway sled, he has cracked or broken several ribs. The pain is forcing him to wrestle with the possibility of giving up. For the others, there are more mundane preoccupations, such as looking for a way to pass the night in relative comfort.
You sleep out every night? Yep. Kind of crowded in the tent before, so...
With lighter sleds, the expedition no longer needs so many dogs. In Peary's day, extra huskies would have been killed and eaten. But for Steger's team, that option is unthinkable. On a predetermined day, a plane arrives to carry 7 animals to safety. Sadly, it will also carry Bob McKerrow, who can no longer tolerate his injury.
Feeling very sad. A little bitter. Now you put 2 years of, you know, preparation into it, and you get crushed by a sled, and I've got something like a broken rib, or I'm not sure, but really it's debilitating, so it's hard to leave.
Yeah. What's the hardest thing of all? Is it just your own personal ambition or the friends you're leaving on the ice?
It's not ambition. I don't think ambition's important. I think it's the close friendships, and there's a sense of letting people down.
The day of McKerrow's departure is a painful one for the rest of the team, but there is little time for sadness or regret. The only thing that matters now is pushing forward.
The conditions are getting better as we predicted, and the weather's getting better, constantly better. Of course, there's always the unknown. We're not certain that we're going to be able to make this dash, because we could get bad weather. We could get open water leads where we'd have to wait 10 days for the leads to close.
We're a determined bunch, you know. We didn't plan for, you know, all this time just to come out here and say, oh, well, it's a little too cold, or we're short of fuel, or this, that, or the other thing. We're going to try every trick in the book, and we've got such a diverse group that everyone's got ideas, and most of them are quite good.
The 2 leaders are doing well. They balance each other really well. When Will's, you know, struggling with the cold, and Paul is full of energy, and when Paul's pushed himself into exhaustion, Will's got the energy, so it's been super so far. I mean, we couldn't ask for more.
You have absolute confidence in them?
Oh, yeah. I keep checking my compass.
Early April. They have been on the ice for 4 long weeks, but they have traveled less than a third of the way to the pole. As the Arctic spring advances, it's easier to move ahead, but the ice is beginning to break apart. Here and there it ripples underfoot, undulating like the surface of a waterbed. There is no reliable way to tell when this shifting mass of frozen water might give way.
Pretty soft.
Open fissures, or leads, begin to form across the landscape, forcing the team to choose its route with increasing caution. A major opening could stop the expedition in its tracks. A smaller one could plunge a sled team into icy water, where death can quickly claim its victim.
On the 14th of April, Anne Bancroft falls into an open lead.
It was a time when you didn't stop and think, oh my God, this is chilly, or this is life-threatening. You do exactly what you hope you would do in an emergency situation, and that's act cool and calm and get the heck out of there.
Pulling herself to safety, Bancroft quickly manages to change her icy clothes. It will take her 2 entire days to feel warm again. Iron Man Mantell is not so fortunate.
That was my heel. Pretty painful.
For days, he has been suffering excruciating pain from frostbitten feet. A blister the size of a silver dollar is making it impossible for him to move as fast as the others, and they cannot afford to slow their pace.
Hard to move.
Mantell continues to move forward every day, hoping that his injury will heal itself. But the Arctic is no place to recover from frostbite. In the end, Mantell admits defeat. He will fly home on the 16th of April, the second person to leave in only 2 weeks.
I almost wish that we were back in the days of the old explorers, when there were no planes, so I wouldn't have to agonize over my decision. It was, I felt, the first time I had really failed on any of my life's goals or dreams. It was also hard because I felt, to a certain extent, that I was letting down my team members, and it'll probably be something that'll haunt me for the rest of my life.
It was a very crushing moment for all of us. I dealt with it by just pushing it out of my mind, because it was so overwhelming, so sad to see Bob leave, that I couldn't deal with it.
By mid-April, open leads are unavoidable.
Ready, go!
Crossing is a cumbersome procedure, even when the gap is narrow, and there is a constant danger that the team will be confronted with a fissure wide enough to separate them from their goal.
You always had the fear in the back of your mind that a lead the size of the Mississippi was going to stop you for days on end while waiting for it to freeze. You just sit back there and kind of pray that won't happen, because time for us was so important that we just keep plodding north.
By late April, the expedition is making good progress, traveling as far as 38 miles a day. But spring is rapidly advancing. In a few more days, the ice is almost sure to break apart. Time is more precious than ever. Faced with dwindling rations, Steger and Shirky have begun to contemplate a radical alternative.
In April, we started discussing what I always termed as the unthinkable or the unspeakable plan, and that was to have the 2 leaders go on and the rest of us would have to go back.
Fairness was a very serious concern. We considered the time, the money, the effort that the other team members had invested. But on the other hand, we were faced with failure by not reaching the pole at all, or success of 3 years of effort.
It was probably the most emotional time on the trip. Richard was brought to tears, which was something that I had never seen before. I think they'd all seen me cry, but it was a very pensive moment for us, because you were suddenly looking at the possibility of not reaching the goal.
In the end, Steger and Shirky cautiously agree to continue with a team of 6, hoping against hope that they can reach the pole before the food runs out. The coming days will be a test of their ability to overcome impossible odds. In their final push for the pole, the team is working 18-hour days. Their optimism is so strong that even the widest leads no longer seem to pose a serious threat.
I remember distinctly crossing a lead, and we used an ice floe as a raft to get our sleds across. And I think 6 people just lit up like Christmas trees at that moment, because we all had seen the picture of Perry doing the exact same thing. That was a very exciting moment for all of us. Our spirits were just soared.
The pole now seems to be within their grasp, but the Arctic has a way of turning unpredictable.
Panic struck on April 29th. I took a series of readings over a course of many hours, and despite our efforts to push forward, the sextant said we weren't going anywhere. And I realized it wasn't us, it was the machine that was in error.
At the time, we only had about 4 days of food left. We never knew for sure whether or not we were traveling on the straight line.
Until they find a way to fix the sextant, they might as well be back where they began. Suddenly, the difference between failure and success depends on Paul's ability to work a miracle.
Paul took the sextant into the tent, and all we had at this point in time in terms of tools was a Swiss Army knife. So he took that and took the sextant apart, something that you didn't dare want to do. It's a very complicated instrument that way.
And inside of this portion of the instrument, I found that frost had accumulated and was wedging the delicate mirrors out of alignment. With a lot of excitement, packed up the sleds once more. I took the instrument out, cleaned it up, and adjusted it back into perfect alignment. We were on our way, knowing that we were just days from the North Pole.
By the 55th day, every step is a kind of victory.
It was probably the highlight of the trip, in that it was maybe one of the most beautiful days that we had. The weather was perfect. We saw water all around us, and we just seemed to find a way through it. Our spirits were so high. We knew we were close. And we kept yelling out that this was an omen. It's for us, because nothing can stop us now.
With a 20-mile day behind them, the team collapses in exhaustion, too worn out to wonder where they are. With any luck, they'll make the pole tomorrow. But morning brings its own surprise. Shirky's readings show the sun to be revolving in a perfect circle, never changing its distance from the horizon. There can be only one explanation. They are standing at the pole.
Suddenly, after 3 years of focusing on north, north is gone. We look around and there's no east, west, everything is south.
Bradley 6-5, Bradley 6-5, do you copy? Over.
When I got the news, it hit home hard and fast. My eyes welled up in tears.
They have conquered the polar sea, crossing almost 500 miles of frozen ocean without resupply. It is an astonishing achievement, too astonishing perhaps to fathom on the ice. Only on the journey home will they begin to understand the magnitude of their accomplishment.
All of a sudden, I got just swelled up in emotion, and I started to cry. And I realized that we had actually done this, something that so many people said was impossible. We actually had accomplished this.
4 members of the polar expedition have remained in Minnesota. In just a moment, we'll be back to talk to them about their experiences and to see film and videotape that until now has not been shown on television. The expedition that Will Steger and Paul Shirky led to the North Pole was historic and unique, not only because of the team's achievements, but also the fact that their efforts were recorded on videotape and film. New Zealander Bob McEnroe and Minnesotan Anne Bancroft carried small film cameras all the way to the North Pole. So, to some extent, we can all share in the experience without getting our feet wet or our noses frostbitten. And it was frostbite that drove you, Bob Mantell, finally out of the expedition. But when we met you, what, 24, 25 days in, you were feeling pretty bad then but didn't come out. What was your state of health at that point?
The pain I had in my toes actually took about 6 weeks before it actually healed up.
Can you describe that pain? I mean,
well, it's just kind of like a sharp pain from time to time, especially when my toes either warmed up or cooled down, kind of like having a needle stuck in them.
Geoff also had frostbite pretty bad at one point in the trip, at least. His face was always badly frostbitten, as was yours. And I think he explained at the time that he'd fallen asleep and the covering had come off his nose.
Yeah, he made a mistake. I think either the covering fell off his nose or he slept with his face out of the sleeping bag and he froze his face pretty severely that night. And in fact, he was in charge of waking us up. He had the alarm clock in his hat so it wouldn't freeze. And that night, the alarm clock froze and we overslept by about an hour.
Will condition, how important was it, and what were the differences of the way you people approached it?
Well, the conditioning is a lot in your mind. I mean, this was not an expedition for someone who is a conditional thinker that thinks they need 8 hours of sleep and so many meals, because you find yourself nearing the pole, for instance, we were sleeping 3-4 hours a day on real short rations. And a lot of times you're faced utterly with something that seems impossible.
It's very hard for a layman like myself to watch this film and watch those dogs pulling these tremendous loads across such vast distances under such extreme conditions for no reason. They had no reason to do it. What drives these dogs?
I think, first of all, it's inherent in them. They love the pull. The worst punishment you could do to one of my dogs is to leave them home. But they pull for you. They're not going to the North Pole. They're pulling for you. They're pulling because you like it, because you want them to pull for you. And it's just out of their love or whatever for yourself, plus their love of pulling, is what makes them pull to the North Pole. Dogs were the real heroes on this expedition. After all, our rations weren't really that bad even at the end of the trip. But the dogs were on rations all the time and took the brunt of the work. And they pulled right up to the very top of the world.
We have some film of Paul feeding the dogs. And you have a can, Science Diet can, and a small cup. And you just throw a small cup of dried dog food to those dogs. Was that a meal for them?
That's all we could afford. We had to, well, it was a big chess game we were playing out there as we're metering out the food. Had to be very careful because we could not afford dog burnout. If their spirits were broken, the trip was over. So every day we'd have debates of just carefully determining, based on their spirits, their energy, and the terrain and the weather, how much food we should give them to keep them going, but making sure there was enough food there to feed them the last day. But it was hard. It was hard to throw a cup of food to them when you knew they were starving and hungry. They'd keep pulling because we made sure that their spirits weren't broken. But they wanted nothing more than to please their masters, and that made the situation with Critter's death, Bob's dog, particularly agonizing for all of us, because Critter the whole trip was out to please Bob. Then when Bob was gone, his master was gone, Critter's spirits went into a slump, and when Critter died 2 days before he reached the pole, it was probably one of the blackest days of the journey for us, short of Bob's departure.
We'll be back in a moment. If there's one thing that the 49 dogs and 8 human beings on this expedition had in common, it was that they were always hungry. And that led to some pretty fancy horse trading on the Arctic Ocean and some strange behavior when it was all over.
Actually, I brought a couple $100 and a deck of cards with the hopes of gambling, and I found out in day 45 I was the only one with money. But Richard and Ann had a little bit of candy. Richard had sugar, or candy. So I bought up his 50 pieces for $1 each, which was a real good buy. Ann had about an ounce and a half that I bought for $10, which was quite a deal too. So it was almost like winning in a game of Monopoly. I had all the sugar and all the trading power in the camp then after that.
And when you got on the plane, Will, our cameras were rolling, and you were surrounded by food. You had champagne, sandwiches, cookies, candy, everything that you could possibly want, and all of you were eating constantly for about 36 hours from the time we picked you up. But I started on the plane. Do you remember that incident, Paul?
Yeah, my wife Susan had sent up care packages, suitcases full of White Castle hamburgers, chocolate chip cookies, all kinds of candy bars and assorted goodies, and Willie was packing them in his jacket pockets on the way home.
And when we arrived to pick up the dogs and we interviewed all of you in the hour and a half we were there, one of the questions we asked you was, what was the most difficult thing you'd had to contend with on the trip so far?
The first time I peed in the tent in the can with 3 guys right next to me.
Was that the case, or were there other things like that you can tell us about?
I think the hardest part up until then, being the only woman on the trip, was just feeling sort of sometimes of loneliness in sort of being the odd one out.
Towards the end of the trip, you decided to sleep 3 to a sleeping bag. Well, how did that work out?
No one really wanted to do this, I don't think, but it was a necessity. And so we decided to test it out actually before. This was about the time when Bob was going to leave us. And I think the first 2 nights in our bag, no one touched. I don't recall anyone touching, and that is a feat in itself because there wasn't much room in this bag. And by the 3rd night or so, we were starting to get pretty used to it. It was fairly warm, and I think we really sort of got our teamwork system down pat by this time, because if Paul turned on his side, then Brent and I turned just like dominoes, and then there'd be somebody else their shoulder would die out, and then we'd flip over to the next side, and we did this in unison. But it was actually very comforting.
The dogs in the documentary that tore into the food supply belonged to Geoff Carroll. How did he keep those wild dogs under control?
They were a wild bunch of dogs. They're called bear dogs. They're from an Eskimo village called Ulik. And these dogs are actually used to kill bears that come into the village. This is how wild they were. Geoff was our strongest member by far, 200 pounds, and his job was to contain that horde of 10 dogs, point them north, and somehow drive them over these ridges. And they were definitely a wild bunch. One time they got loose and tried to eat the stock of the rifle.
They ate Bob McCarroll's boots.
They ate Bob McCarroll's boots. One time I was running in front of these dogs, and I looked back, and they were eyeing me like a pork chop. I mean, they were looking at me as a piece of food, and that was pretty scary.
Richard, let's talk about Richard for a minute. Richard was a very important, as you all were, member of the expedition for very special reasons.
Yeah, Richard was a very experienced and skilled on cross-country skis, and we used him as a trail scout later in the trip. The conditions were too rough to use skis for the first month, but when the temperatures moderated a bit and the ice got a little bit gentler, then skis proved useful. And he would shoot well out ahead, a mile or 2 in front of the sleds at times, weaving in and out of these ridges, looking for a gap that would save us hours of hard chopping to get the sleds through. And so as a trail scout, his skiing skill proved invaluable towards the end of the trip and saved us many, many hours where we would otherwise have to chop through a ridge when he, in fact, had found a detour around.
Anne read a statement at the North Pole. Who wrote that?
I drafted a piece, and then we worked it over as a team, which we felt would reflect our feelings about the trip. And so those feelings then we shared with the world. And when we reached the pole, and Anne read our statement to the press.
It's a great day for us. We thank God we've arrived at the top of the world in good health and spirits. We are deeply indebted to the 49 Huskies and Canadian Eskimo dogs who pulled us so long and hard to bring us here at the top of the world. They are the real heroes of this journey. And at this special moment in our lives, we feel much gratitude to the governments, companies, organizations, and individuals who have been supporting us through their donations, volunteered assistance, thoughts, and prayers. We felt you standing by us every step of the way. The journey across the polar sea was filled with paradox. Surrounded by the gentle pastel beauty of the ice, snow, and low-lying sun, we endured the hardest work, most hostile conditions any of us have ever experienced. At times there were tears of despair when obstacle after obstacle seemed to spell defeat. At times we were overwhelmed by exhilaration as we made major breakthroughs. But most of the time we just worked very hard, wrestling every mile forward for progress through the polar sea. We experienced pain, cold, hunger, and fatigue. For us, the significance of this is that we are able to better empathize with people all over the world for whom these are daily experiences, much of their lives, and who deserve the world's attention far more than we do. On a brighter note, this journey reaffirmed for us that hope springs eternal. In our moments of despair, we always found reason to persevere. As 6 adventurers from different parts of the world stand where the lines of longitude of all countries meet, we believe this journey stands for hope. Hope that our seemingly impossible goals can be met by people everywhere. Our only regret is that 2 of our team members, Bob Mantell and Bob McKiro, who gave everything they had to this journey before injury turned them back, are not here to share this moment with us. To them we dedicate this day.
You'd think that once 2 men had led an expedition to the top of the world, that would be enough. Well, not it seems for the likes of Will Steger and Paul Shirky, who are now well into the planning of another adventure, this time to the bottom of the world and Antarctica. What exactly have you 2 guys got in mind now?
Well, 3 years from now, we're planning a 5,000-mile traverse of the Antarctic continent by dog team.
Paul, why would you do such a thing?
Well, we figure we've accumulated a unique set of skills and experiences that can only be applied in one other spot on the planet, so thank God there's only 2 poles.
What would be the most difficult thing about traveling across the whole continent of Antarctica?
Well, it's the isolation and distance. Like, there's an area, 2,000-mile area called the Area of Inaccessibility that's never been crossed by man. And it's just the vastness of it.
We're almost out of time. We have to take a short break, and then we'll leave you with a musical tribute to the 8 people that made the Steger expedition to the North Pole so successful.
Every long journey is made of small steps, is made of the courage, the feeling you get. You know it is waiting, been waiting for you. The journey's the only thing you want to do. And we cannot know what you go through or see through your eyes, but we will surround you, the bright undisguised. In any direction, whatever you view, you're taking our love there with you. In every long journey, what drives you to go? It's half what you know and half what you don't. The secret's been waiting, your heart's got the key. The secret's the only thing you want to see. We cannot know what you go through or see through your eyes, but we will surround you, the pride undisguised. In any direction, whatever you view, you're taking our love there with you. Every long journey begins with a dream, a spirit with courage to make it all real. The dream has been calling to you. The dream is the only thing you want to do. And we cannot know what you go through or see through your eyes, but we will surround you, the pride undisguised. In any direction, whatever you view, you're taking our love there with you. We cannot know what you go through or see through your eyes, but we will surround you, the pride undisguised. In any direction, whatever you view, you're taking our love, taking our love, taking our love there with you.